All right, so it is 6 p.m. in the UK and I guess 10 a.m. in San Francisco. I'm Matt Cockrell, the co-founder of Cookbook, and I'm here to welcome you to the first in a series of Cookbook live streams and Q&As with cookbook authors and other leaders from the food world. So it's coming up to Easter, and what better topic than chocolate? And we're delighted to welcome two experts in the field. Amy Guittard is the 5th generation at the family-owned Guittard Chocolate Company and is responsible for the company's marketing and brand direction, and is also the author of its cookbook, which you'll find on Cookbook itself. With a history spanning more than 150 years, the Guittard Chocolate Company is one of the world's most respected makers and suppliers of premium chocolate. Emily Luchetti, our other panelist, has helped define what great pastry means in America. After attending culinary school and working at Jeremiah Tower's legendary Stars restaurant in San Francisco, Emily says she switched to the sweet side and never looked back. So Amy and Emily will be running through their top tips on cooking with chocolate and recommending some recipes you can use to try out those different types of chocolate. And they'll also be answering questions as we go and also in a Q&A session at the end. So please absolutely post your questions into the Q&A box in Zoom. And with that, I will hand over to Amy to continue.
Thanks so much, Matthew. Thanks everyone for being here. We know there's lots of different time zones out there. So whether it's the morning, middle of the afternoon or evening, we really thank you for joining us today, and hopefully it will be a fruitful and adventurous chat. So just as a reminder, I think everyone's muted just by the nature of the Zoom webinar, but if you've got questions, please put them in the Q&A. I'll be doing my best to monitor the chat and the Q&A, but it's much easier if we can funnel all the questions to the Q&A, and we'll either answer them live or we'll try to answer them in the chat. Following this webinar, we will also be sending out a follow-up with some of the recipes and links and such. So thank you again all, and please don't hesitate to ask any question that comes up, and we'll do our best to answer as many of them as we can. So with that, I guess my first question for Emily, which is something that I've actually always wondered and I've never asked you, which is sort of the background of how you even got into pastry. Like growing up, did you bake a lot? If so, did you experiment, or did you have sort of a library of cookbooks that you would reference? You know, if you can share a little bit about that, because I think it might lead into some of what we get into today, just about experimentation and trying different types of chocolate.
Yeah, I would say, you know, my mom and dad and my grandparents, they all cooked, but no one really baked in the family. My grandmother made this hot fudge sauce that was really grainy and disgusting, and I never liked it, and it stuck to your teeth when I was a kid. And so, but my baking experience was like back of the box brownies, Duncan Hines Bach mix cake, that kind of thing. I really didn't fledge out to make a lot of homemade stuff just because we didn't have it. And then when I got into cooking, I actually started cooking on the savory side, and I was there for about 7 years. And then when I was at Stars, I kind of eyeing the department, and I didn't like working the line, and I just saw the pastry department on the other side of the kitchen, and I said, you know, I think this is what I want to do. And I remember my husband saying, Peter saying to me, well, how do you know you want to do it? I don't know. I said, there's this pull and this draw. And I switched, and I talked Jeremiah into letting me become the pastry chef there, because the other person was pregnant and was leaving, and he let me try it. And it was one of those things that the first day I'm like totally in the weeds, and I didn't know what I was doing, but I still felt like I was home and this is where I belonged.
That's amazing. I don't think I knew that you started in savory. So then how did you have sort of a library of recipes, or did you sort of iterate and teach yourself as you went through that process of transitioning?
When I first started, like there was a recipe box, and I stuck very close to the recipe box, and I would just get up really early in the morning in case I messed something up. I could have enough time to throw it out and, you know, and make it again. And people would say, gosh, everything you make tastes so good. And it's like, well, at least I know, I may not know how to make it, but I know when it's right. So I know when to throw it out and when to serve it. And then the more experience I got, the more I started fiddling around with things and experimenting. And also, when you're in a professional kitchen, there's so much stimulus around that you have wheels going on the back of your head. Like you see the chocolate. I mean, you see the chocolate next to the creme fraiche, and it was like, for two different applications, it's like, oh my God, what would happen if I put those two together somehow? So your mind is always going.
Yeah. Well, and I think that speaks to some of what you and I talk about often, and that hopefully we'll get into today, which is sort of the spirit and enthusiasm behind experimenting, specifically with chocolate, and not being afraid of, chocolate can be a very intimidating topic for a lot of people, whether you're, professional pastry chef or a home baker, just because there's so many variables to take into consideration, whether it's a natural cocoa powder or a Dutch cocoa powder, or a, even the simplest thing as a difference in percentage of cacao. And so to your point, and you've mentioned this to me before in a variety of contexts, is not to be afraid to try and, to throw it out, or to, and not trying to encourage food waste, but, put it off to the side and snack on it, but keep trying and not be afraid to make mistakes.
Because I think the true point to that is, if you use two different chocolates, the odds are, and the larger percentage of the time, it is going to work out in both cases. Maybe one will be thinner, maybe one you have to put whipped cream on and serve it in a bowl instead of slicing it and putting it on a plate. But the majority of the time, they're all going to be edible and delicious, whether or not you want to, do that again, or if you want to tweak it and do something else. So I think that you can get worked up, but you can also just relax. I mean, it's just chocolate, and it's going to taste good. So just, don't get too nervous about it.
Right. No, it's always a good thing to remind ourselves.
Before we jump into the first thing that we're going to talk about, I did want to ask you though, because when I look at, your job, it's like, oh gosh, my family had a newspaper business, and I would have been third generation, and it never crossed my mind to go into that business. And then I think of you, Amy, and I think of, gosh, was there ever a point you didn't want to go into the chocolate business? You go, oh, that's just a family business, I'm going to go, do something else? Or was it always a draw?
I mean, it's funny. When I was growing up, I wanted to be a cheerleader or a bus driver. So nothing to do with chocolate. But I mean, obviously I grew up around it. My mom actually had a candy store when I was a kid. It was a store called American Pie on Sacramento and Baker in San Francisco. So my mom had a candy store, and my dad would come home from work smelling like chocolate. So I was kind of always surrounded by, that world. And, Matthew had mentioned this early on. I'm the fifth generation. So when I was a little girl, my grandfather and uncle were both working alongside my dad. They both passed away within a very short time period of each other when I was quite young, but I have pretty vivid, visceral memories of going to the factory as a little girl, and climbing on the cocoa bean sacks that were in the cocoa bean room, and walking through the factory with my dad, and seeing my grandfather and my uncle there. And, I think that family ties are strong. And, I think even if you, at least in the case of myself, I studied literature and cultural anthropology in school. I never went to culinary school. I loved to bake. I loved the idea of chocolate. And I knew that I always wanted to work in food and food systems. I worked for an energy bar company called Cliff Bar here in the States right out of college. And that really exposed me to the world of food and food systems and supply chain and organic and all that kind of stuff. And I think that's really what inspired me to think about coming into the business. So I think always in the back of my head, I was always interested in it, just because it's such a fascinating topic. And I've been working at Guittard now for about 10 years, and there's always something new. There's never a dull moment in the chocolate industry. And whether it's baking or looking at different ways of making chocolate, or, speaking with chefs like yourselves or home bakers, I just think it's a really interesting world. So I could never imagine leaving, and I'm so grateful to have the opportunity to work in the industry now. So, but yeah, I think maybe the fact that I was exposed to a candy store and a chocolate company had something to do with where I ended up today. So. But since we are here to talk about chocolate, I'd love to kind of jump into some of the complexities of working with it. So just for everyone who's joining us, we're going to try and walk through sort of 3 different scenarios and expose everyone to sort of some general topics on percentages and powders and different kinds of chocolate, and all the variables to take into consideration when baking, as Matthew had alluded to. So I guess, Emily, I think maybe one of the first topics that we could talk about is percentages. And I think you've got a recipe that could highlight that, if you want to reference that.
Yeah, there's a ice cream sandwich cookie that I make that I've been making forever. And as I've made it over and over the years, I've noticed that it kind of acts differently. Again, it works out every time, but I was always just kind of curious of the differences. And even last night when I did 2 batches, one with 55% and one with 70%. And I was learning, is like, oh, I never had done them side by side. So it was really pretty interesting. So basically it's chocolate and butter that are melted together. You're going to have, actually, he just put the recipe up in the chat so you can see it, but it's chocolate and it's also on the cover of my ice cream book. So if you want to see a picture of it, it's chocolate and butter that have been melted together. And then you whip egg yolks and sugar till they're thick. And then you add the chocolate and the butter, and then you add a little bit of flour and baking powder. So when I did the 55 and the 70, as I said, I did them side by side. And when you scoop the batter to go onto the sheet trays, I did it once when I had just added the chocolate. It was just finished mixing. And so the mixture was much warmer because the chocolate was warm. And if you see, and the reason these are the 55% hot ones. And the reason they're sticking, I didn't Gorilla Glue them on. They're just stuck from last night when I never moved them. So you can see when they were hot, this is hot in the 55%, they just spread out very evenly. But if you look at the hot 70%, you can see how this one's much puffier. Can you see that? And this one is much flatter. I don't know. Here, maybe I can go like this. You can see the differences. And so what I did with this one, the flatter one, is halfway through baking, I squashed it down with the flat side of a measuring cup because I didn't want it this thick, just because it's so intense chocolatey. When it gets the ice cream between it, it just is too much chocolate in one kind of bite. So then what I did was I let the chocolate sit in the batter, the whole batter thing, for about 15 minutes. And what I noticed on the 55 is, this is the cold one. And this was this is the hot one. Now you can see they're about the same thickness, but this hot one here has more of a crinkly top on it. So that's the difference there, but I really didn't have to squash these down. They never domed, they flattened nicely. And then on the cold 70%, I actually got the same thing where I got the more domed cookie here. So I had to flatten it down. But again, if you look at the difference in the textures here, this is the hot 70 and this is the colder 70. You can see, I don't know if you can see, but this one has it doesn't have the glisten and the shine to it as much as this one does. Also, the 70% was a much thinner batter just from the get-go. And I could even tell that when I melted the chocolate and the butter and I had it in the double boiler, it was just a much thinner mixture. And that's because it doesn't have as much sugar in it. It's just more cocoa butter and the chocolate liqueur. So there's just more fat in it. So that's going to make it thinner. Yeah. And so I also know that. Go ahead. No, I was going to say there's a question somewhere about melting chocolate and doing it in a double boiler or versus on top of the stove. I know people swear by the microwave version, but I always do it over a double boiler just because you just put it there. I just turn on the heat. I get the water boiling. I put my stainless steel pot on top and then I turn it off. And you don't have to worry about it. With a microwave, you have to go back every 15 seconds and stir. And it's just, to me, it's more trouble than it's worth. So. Yeah, no, I'm kind of in the same camp as you with regards to double boiler. I also don't have a microwave, so I'm biased. But so it sounds, based on what you're saying, that there's various things to consider. It's both percentage as well as temperature, and you'll get different results based on both. Right, exactly. Yeah. And I think just a note on percentages, because it can be a bit confusing. So percentages are the total amount of cocoa mass, which includes both the mass and any added butter.
in the final formula. So for instance, you could have a 60% chocolate that is, the 60% is only contributed by ground cocoa beans, which is 50% fat, 50% solid inherently. And so if you could also have a 60%, that's a 55% mass with a 5% added butter, in which case your mass is a, 55, again, half butter, half solid, then you're adding an additional 5% of butter to that. So your rheology and your viscosity of your chocolate is going to be very different the more cocoa butter you add. If you have added cocoa butter, it's going to perform differently than if you don't add added cocoa butter. So, you might see on shelf two 70% and assume they're exactly the same. 170% could have 10% added cocoa butter, and it's going to taste more like a 60% than a 70% that has no added cocoa butter. So, I think it's something important to keep in mind when you're selecting chocolates based on percentages. Some chocolate companies, we do this, we reveal the total fat percent content. This is for our couverture that professional pastry chefs are using, because it's really important when formulating. If you're formulating like a ganache, you've got to know how much fat is in there to be able to know how much to add. So I kind of nerded out a little bit there. And if you're interested in more topics specific to that, we're happy to answer those questions. But I wanted to make the note because I think that it is really important to start getting just sort of a basic grasp of percentage to better understand how it might impact your baking, specifically when you're getting into more technical stuff. But I don't know if you want to answer more to that, Emily.
Yeah, actually, I think two good extremes to kind of explain that is, if you look at the American craft chocolate movement, a lot of the people like Dandelion and the small makers, they are not putting any added cocoa butter in at all. It's just sugar and the ground beans. And then the more European style is they add more cocoa butter. So if and when you go to taste that, if you put them, each in your mouth, the European style, the ones with the more cocoa butter, are going to melt faster in your mouth, and you're going to even feel it on your fingers. So if you're working at home in a recipe and you're just doing things like this and you're not formulating ganaches and things like that, you really don't have to like say, oh no, what is this 5% added cocoa butter or whatever. But companies like Guittard that actually put this on their packaging, I think is great, because it allows people to learn as much as they possibly can about the products that they're buying. And one thing too, I wanted to say about the cookies, the difference between the 70 and the 55, obviously 55 has more sugar than the 70, but the 55 didn't taste too sweet. So I think that's something that's important to learn too, is some people love the intensity of a 70% chocolate. Some, don't want something quite so, shocking in their mouth. So when I'm doing recipes, pretty much anything between 50 and 55 and 65 or lower, all those recipes are pretty interchangeable. When sometimes you start adding a 70, and I think that's where most of the recipes in home cookbooks are geared for, unless they say 70. And when you get to 70, some of them will work, but the texture starts to change of the finished product. And so I think that's when you want, and sometimes it tastes, I don't want to say drier because that sounds negative, which it's not really drier because there's so much fat and cocoa bean mass in there. That's not going to be drier, but it has a little bit of a different texture to it.
Yeah, no, I think that's interesting. I also think it's interesting too, and this is a nod to the experimentation piece that we were mentioning earlier, where you could replace, your chocolate and we'll get to this a bit later as well, in like a chocolate chip cookie, replace your standard semi-sweet chip with, 64% wafer. But Emily, this is also a question for you. Do you find that you have to change the batter to match the change in intensity of chocolate? Because there could be such a jump from sort of the sweetness of a batter that's a bit married more for the sweetness of, say, a semi-sweet chip versus do you ever find that there's a disconnect between like a intense chocolate flavor and the sweetness of a standard cookie dough?
Yeah, I think that definitely is true. And I think that's kind of a good geek out thing, where someone would just taste it and they say, well, that's just too sweet. They wouldn't really analyze where the sweetness was coming from, whether it was the sweet or if it was the chocolate or the cookie. Because I think what happens with and again, we could jump to chocolate chip cookies and then come back, but when one of the beauties of the chocolate chip cookie is you get that hint of the chocolate, the bitterness of it, and it could be 55 bitter, it doesn't have to be 70, in contrast to the sweet butter sugary part of it. And that's one of the things that makes a great cookie like that.
Yeah. No, I think that's important. Why don't we just jump to those? Because since we're talking about it already. So I baked last night. I was a little bit delirious because of a very long day. But one of the things that I think is always really interesting to talk about is, again, sort of replacing the form factors of chocolate. So for instance, we have chips, wafers, and baking bars, and you could chop your baking bars. You can use wafers and you can use chips. Here in the States, chocolate chips are oftentimes used to make chocolate chip cookies. But more and more often you're seeing folks experimenting with replacing those chocolate chips with, say, a wafer. And so what I did is I made a batch of chocolate chip cookie dough, and then threw in baking chips. So I used our 63% chips. Everything in here is sort of a 63% range. So this is our 63% chip. Excuse my nails. Half my hands are painted, half of them are not. And then the other cookie, this was a wafer based cookie. And then this was a chopped baking bar. So you can see sort of the differences in, this is a little bit more organic. You've got different sizes in there based on how I chopped it. Your wafers have a little bit more of a layering effect here. And then your chocolate chips themselves sort of bulk up and provide sort of, I always say chips because of they tend to have a lower cocoa butter content. They don't melt as much as, say, a chopped baking bar or a wafer. So they're almost going to serve as an architectural component to the cookie and sort of hold it up a little bit more because they're not going to melt as much versus, say, the wafers that will melt a bit more and sort of have that layering effect in the cookie. So Emily, I don't know if you want to speak more to that and sort of your experience from the rheology side of things, from using different types of chocolate.
Yeah. I would say, over the years, I had gotten away from using the chips. One, because this was years ago, before I discovered your 63 chocolate chips, which are really good, because usually the chips are so sweet and they don't move in a cookie. I mean, when I said they move, they don't, when they put in the oven, because of the lack of the cocoa butter, they just don't spread or go anywhere. And so to get enough of that chocolate cookie ratio, it has to be so many of them, but then they're almost too many because it's just, they're so small in the dispersion, then it's a full cookie. So, but the 63% is, you want that little hint of chocolate, of the intensity of the chocolate as often as you can. As far as I like personally using the wafers or the 63 chips, just because I like the consistency of them. One of the things when you chop a bar is you sometimes get little tiny shards, you get bigger pieces, and that can be good, but I don't know, I just prefer something more uniform when I'm putting it in my chocolate chip cookies. But I like the way that the wafers kind of spread and you get more, and they also, the texture, once it's inside the dough, and even if it's baked, it stays softer. It doesn't, because it's encased with everything, it doesn't get as hard as like a chip does, or if it was just that same piece of chocolate, on the side.
Yeah, I always describe like a cookie made with wafers is going to be like a little ooier and gooier, and a little bit more puddlier, if you will, and versus chips. Yeah, and then this, I just pulled this as to show, this again is an example of a chopped baking bar. So as Emily was saying, it's just sort of organic looking, and not a lot of consistency, and the cross section of it is just little pieces versus that layering of wafers.
Yeah.
We had a question. Oh, go ahead.
Okay. No, let's go to questions.
No, we just had a question regarding back to percentages. So someone asked, is that why 70% chocolate tastes better because there's more cocoa butter? Because not all 70% tastes the same. Could it be because of more cocoa butter? So 70%, there's lots of things that contribute to flavor. cocoa butter does have flavor to it, but if you can imagine the mass of the chocolate, so not including the cocoa butter additions, that's what, you know, the main flavor of chocolate comes from the beans, and different beans from different regions taste differently. So cocoa grows 10 to 15 degrees either side of the equator. Different regions where it grows have very different flavor characteristics. And so you might have a 70% that's made only from Madagascar beans. You might have a 70% that's a blend that's made from Madagascar and Ecuador and, you know, maybe some Ivory Coast. And that's going to have a very different flavor profile. So there's a lot of things that go into differences in flavor notes for percentages.
Right. And also the roasting, you know, how a chocolate company roasts their beans. It's a lot. I like to equate it to wine. You know, each winery will get a batch of grapes, and if you give 4 winemakers the same grape, they're going to come up with a different tasting product. You might all recognize it's the same grape, but at the same time, it's going to taste differently, because roasting can bring out nuances of a certain bean, or they can just squash it. And some companies roast to a really, really high temperature because they want that intensity, and some roast much lighter. So that has a real effect too.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought that up, Emily, because, you know, we pride ourselves on, you know, listening to the beans and letting them tell us how they like to be roasted. You know, different origins like to be roasted differently. And you know, as Emily was saying, different roasting characteristics can bring out different flavors. It's like coffee. You know, we all know what coffee is like with a light roast versus a dark roast or a medium roast. Not only do certain companies have propensities, but also different beans will taste very differently if you roast them different ways. So at Guittard, our philosophy is trying to maintain the integrity of the beans to the best of our ability, and treat them and craft them in a way that makes them come to life in their most sort of inherent way possible, if you will. So we it's really important to us. I call it sort of the evolution of artistry, that, you know, you've got these farmers that cultivate these beautiful you know, beans, and then they arrive at our factory, and it's our responsibility to sort of treat them with the same level of respect and artistry that the farmers bestowed on them, so that we can give them to folks like Emily and home bakers as well, who can sort of bestow their own level of artistry to that bean. So you know, respecting the bean is kind of what we preach, and that has a lot to do with how it's roasted and processed.
Yeah, I also think though that it's important that people don't think that, oh, the beans just come to you and they're great, because I think one of the amazing things about Guittard is you guys go work with the farmers, and before they're even sent to you and they're dried, they have to be fermented and then dried. They have to be harvested, fermented, and dried. And how that is done is extremely crucial to a bean and how a bean tastes. And then you get a harvest every year that depends on Mother Nature, and did it get enough rain? Did it get too much rain? So there's so many factors involved, from, you know, the tree sitting in the ground. So Amy and everybody there, it's just so impressive of how there's just so much involvement, and it goes all the way back. And that also mentions that it's important to mention how much they work. And, you know, I'm not doing this to promote Amy, but I'm just in awe, and I'm just very much admire it, is the work that they do with the farmers there, and making sure the farmers have a livelihood, they're getting paid good product, and they're being treated fairly. And I think that that's really important in the chocolate world. I mean, that's a conversation for a whole nother day, but there's so many companies that do not do that. So I think we need to buy Guittard just for that reason, if nothing else.
Oh, thanks, Emily. But yeah, I mean, I just want to go back to what you were mentioning too, and I want to get back to these other topics as well. But you know, post-harvest practices, as you alluded to, are another really crucial component of having different flavor profiles coming from different origins. You know, fermentation and drying. You know, the beans grow on a tree, or the pods grow on a tree, and then you harvest the beans and you ferment and dry them, and that's such a crucial component to developing flavor. And you know, we've got a couple partnerships with flavor labs in various countries that we help and work in collaboration with them to sort of dial in what those post-harvest practices are, and disseminating that out to farmer groups, and then also just assessing planting materials and such to maintain the integrity of the beans that are unique to each origin. So there's so much work that's being done out there, not just by us, but by lots of other folks. And there's lots of information on our website. And as Emily said, we can dig into it on another topic. There's so much to talk about today. But I'm really glad you brought that up. I had another question that someone asked regarding chips, wafers, and baking bars as far as emulsifiers. So chips, wafers, and baking bars all use sunflower lecithin. That's what we use at Guittard. So hopefully that answers your question. And then I think we should, is there anything else that you wanted to add more on these?
No, I think we should go on to brownies.
Okay, yeah.
The interesting thing, we were talking about what kind of dessert groups we wanted to talk about. And one of the things that I think was interesting for both of us is you think about a brownie, and it's such a quintessential American dessert. But a brownie is not a brownie is not a brownie. There's so many different ways to make it. There's so many opinions on how people like them, if it's fudgy or cakey or nuts or whatever. But this is one of a really great example of something that you can make at home. You know, brownies you can make at home relatively easily, and you can use different chocolates and you can use different cocoa powders, and you really get a good baseline and a good comparison across the board of how these different ingredients work. So, you know, there are different traditional ways. You can make brownies with unsweetened chocolate, which is now called 100% chocolate because there's no sugar or anything added to it at all. 100% chocolate. You can use cocoa powder, and within that cocoa powder category, there are different ones. You can use bittersweet. You can use a combination of any of those. So, Amy, you want to maybe talk a little bit about that and your brownie research?
Yeah, I mean, my brownie research, you probably are much more tuned in on the brownie research, but just in general, I think what Emily was saying, you know, there's cakey and fudgy, and that's sort of the simplest way that I go into it. But then there's also, let's say you wanted to do, so a fudgier brownie in my experience would come from using an unsweetened chocolate or 100%. A cakier brownie would come from using powder. That's again, sort of my experience. Emily, I don't know if you align with that. And, you know, if you were to use a cocoa powder based brownie recipe, there's lots of different types of powders. And I think the simplest to think about is a natural cocoa powder or a Dutch processed cocoa powder. Both of those, we make a variety of different powders with different fat content and, you know, different levels of Dutching. And each of them will yield a very different kind of brownie, mostly based on color. And so a natural cocoa powder means that it has not been processed other than just so basically oh, there you are. Sorry, just said screen sharing. Hopefully everyone can still hear me. Cocoa powder is processed, is made by, after you roast your cocoa beans, you grind them, you mill them. It's called unsweetened chocolate. You take that unsweetened chocolate and put it through a hydraulic press and squeeze out the butter. So what's left is just the cocoa mass. It's basically a big cake. And that's what's used to make cocoa powder. If you're Dutching it, then it goes through a Dutching process where you're adding an alkali, which is basically stripping out the acidity. So you can imagine that you're going to have very different flavor profiles as well from a natural cocoa powder versus a Dutch processed cocoa powder. Natural cocoa powder will maintain the inherent sort of flavor notes of the beans that you're using to make that powder. A Dutch process is going to taste a little bit more, you're stripping the acid, so the flavor is going to be a little bit more dialed back. You might equate it to that Oreo cookie flavor note that we're all familiar with, that nostalgic people describe it as chocolatey, but for me, chocolate is complex and acidic. And so it's a little bit more muted, but it's got a really dark chocolate color to it. So a lot of people like it because it adds depth of color. So if you were to make the same brownie recipe with a natural powder versus a Dutch powder, it's going to look very different and taste a little bit different. So I think that's something important to keep in mind. A lot of recipes don't specify what kind of cocoa powder to use. They just say cocoa powder. And so that's a real opportunity for home bakers and pastry chefs to sort of take a step back and really ask the question, well, what kind of brownie do I want? Do I want a lighter brownie with a little bit more complexity of flavor? Do I want like a really rich, dark brownie that, has some that Dutch notes to it? And so that's a decision point. And then to the same degree, if you want a fudgy or cakier, then if you want fudgy, then you just go with 100% chocolate. But that's kind of the basics. Emily, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, I think, I have a couple different brownie recipes that I do. One actually has a combination of bittersweet chocolate, a little bit unsweetened, and some cocoa powder. And the
combo.
I've made it without the cocoa powder, and they're really good, but adding that and it's got like 3 tablespoons of cocoa powder in, so it's not that much, but it adds like a chocolate intensity in a hit. And to Amy's point earlier, it's like more one-dimensional, like chocolate with all its fat and things like that is much more complex, where this is more like a bitter kind of hit that you do when you think of an Oreo or something that you get, or something like, if you have chocolate sorbet that's made with cocoa powder, and then one that's made with, melted chocolate, they're going to taste texturally and just flavor-wise, they're going to taste totally different. And I think there's sometimes that I like that cocoa powder intensity, just because it is so strong. And then there's another brownie recipe that I make that I actually put in, and when I compare recipes, it's like, well, how do you compare? I usually do it by the number of eggs. Like if I have 2 recipes side by side, because because those things being equal, and sometimes you can't really divide an egg in half or something. So there's one recipe that I make, I was comparing them the other night, for the truffle brownies, that I think was sent out last night when you got one of your reminders. That has more chocolate in it, and it has more butter. So when I serve those, I call them truffle brownies, because I just put them in tiny little bits. But then my other ones, I'll just get a nice big piece. And I don't know, I believe there's room in this world for the cakies and the fudgies. I would definitely believe in the fudgies more, but I think it's really interesting that people play. And I do like the crackery, light flaky stuff that comes on top, which comes from the cocoa powder. So it really just is, I think, personal preference. I think the biggest thing when you make brownies, whatever you make them with, is don't overbake them. Make sure that, if you're putting the skewer in or the toothpick, that there's still stuff on there. If it comes out clean, then they're just too cooked. So
yeah, no, that's a good point. So when you're so 2 questions for that brownie recipe that adds a little powder, are you using a natural powder or a Dutch powder?
I've done both. Yeah, okay. I've done both. And I think because it is such a small amount, it doesn't affect it one way or another.
Yeah.
But also when I do, like, there's certain things that I do. I make a chocolate roulade, like a jelly roll cake that's a chocolate, and then I unrolled it, and then I put ice cream in and fold it back up. And I've done that with both cocoa powder and melted chocolate, but the texture of it is, one, so much easier to work with just the cocoa powder. And also it just is, the cocoa powder allows you to get a chocolate flavor in there without it being too overpowering, without it being too intense, and sometimes just, running the show when you don't want it to run the show. Because I want the ice cream that it's with to, to stand up to it as much as it can.
Right.
So.
Someone asked, will adding liquid glucose make your brownie fudgier?
I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know.
You try it and let us know.
Yes.
I think it would. It's a liquid though, so I don't think that it necessarily would. Yeah.
Yeah. And then someone else asked, how would you incorporate Mexican chocolate into different recipes?
The thing is with a Mexican chocolate, which is ground coarser, and also a lot of the ones that I've had, you can taste the sugar, not just as a chocolate, it's the cocoa pods ground coarser, the sugar's coarser. So I think to melt that and add it into a recipe, I think you'd have to be pretty careful and try it, because your sugar amount's going to be affected. To chop it up and put it in cookies or something like that, I think you would be fine. Again, you're going to have, it's going to affect the sweetness of it, but I'm sure it would be delicious.
Yeah. And then we also had a question about black cocoa powder and how to use it best in recipes. Do you want to answer that one, Emily?
Oh, you can.
Okay. So black cocoa powder is just a super, super heavy Dutch powder, and it's very, very dark, as the name lends itself. And I know people who use it mostly in cakes, and maybe a pound cake as well. But there's a bakery in New York that has a Brooklyn blackout cake that uses a black cocoa. It's, it has a very intense flavor to it, and it works in various applications. And we make one. It's available on the professional side, food service side of our business. But yeah, it's a beautiful product, and it works in specific applications. I can't remember what the fat content is on that one. I should know offhand, but I don't remember. But yeah, I don't know if you have any other thoughts, Emily.
Yeah, no, I think blackout cake, I was going to say, is probably the most traditional one. It's like a sponge cake or whatever. It's got that texture to it, but with cocoa powder, without any chocolate. And it's actually a really great versatile recipe that can be used for so many different applications. And we used to laugh too, because I think everyone in America in every pastry shop and restaurants using the same blackout cake recipe.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's great. And, I think, I'm assuming you could also use it for frosting.
Mm-hmm. Well, and also something like their chocolate sauce, when you get into the whole subject of chocolate sauce, you can make sauce just using cocoa. And the thing that I like, and using the blackout would be delicious with that, because it would be so intense. The viscosity is different on a cocoa one, because usually it's got like more of a sugar syrup, base versus a chocolate base. And it's a little bit thinner, so it doesn't have that rich, intense mouthfeel, that fatty mouthfeel that regular chocolate sauce has, which can be nice depending on what you want to do it with, because you get more of a contrast. It's almost a little bit kind of refreshing and not so fatty tasting. So I have not made blackout with that, but I bet you that would be really good.
Yeah, no, for sure. I agree with you on that one. We also had a question from Chris that was submitted prior to the webinar. I'm going to let you answer this one. Do you believe that you should be able to taste a bonbon shell and that you should pair your filling with it? Or do you believe you should not taste the shell and that it should be a neutral downplayed flavor compared to the filling?
Actually, I saw this question last night and I just loved it, because it's such you could talk 45 minutes on this one question.
I know. That's why I'm letting you answer this one.
Anything you put in your mouth, you shouldn't be able to taste, because that's the whole point of it. And then, but when you think of a bonbon, and a nice bonbon, the shell on it is really, really thin. And so and then you have whatever your filling is going to be, is because there's just more of it, you're going to get that much more of a taste. But when you put it in your mouth, the first thing you're going to get is that shell. And it may not be something that it disappears so quickly, you may not register it completely, but it's sending something to your brain. So I think it's really important that it does taste right, and it depends on what you're putting in your filling. Like, for instance, if you're going to just do chocolate on chocolate, they could be more the same flavor profile, and then your shell is really just giving you more of a thin textural crisp hit before you get to the softer filling. Or if you did something like more of a milk chocolate on the outside and a passion fruit filling inside, that chocolate, regardless of how thin it is going to give you a different taste. So it's going to be more of a contrast than a passion fruit filling would be. So one, I think it's really important, but two, I think that you have to realize when it's in the person's mouth, how long it's going to have an effect.
Yeah, no, I think that's such a good way of putting it. We've got two pastry chefs on staff here, Donald Russell and Josh Johnson, and they do a lot of R&D and recipe development, and they love our 61%, which is, again, for pastry chefs and on the food service side of our business. But they love the 61% because it's a little bit more neutral, but yet it's still a really flavorful base. So it tends to marry really well with a lot of different flavors. And switching out your chocolate in a tempering or a enrobing machine can be quite challenging. And so having a product that works for a variety of different fillings is something that they've sort of nailed in as the 61%. So kind of in line with what you were saying, Emily, is that, you can go a variety of different ways, but also recognizing that the first taste is going to be that shell, but also making sure that it's sort of marrying with the flavors as well, which that 61% does.
Yeah.
But yeah, I guess kind of in the same vein, just in general, like, what do you take? I know we've talked about a lot, so this is this kind of going back, summarizing to a certain degree, but what do you take into consideration when choosing a chocolate to use in a recipe, knowing that it's obviously going to differ based on the recipe, but are there a couple tips that you can provide, folks who are here today with things to consider and take into account?
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple broad, really broad things of, we talked about before, is just the values of a company and how they do business. But I kind of do that with everything in my life, whatever I buy. But then, after that, I think about what I want the end result to be. Do I want it to be an intense chocolatey thing? I never have ever wanted to make desserts where people can't eat the whole piece. I mean, like, some people will make desserts and they just like, oh my God, that was so intense chocolate, I couldn't even finish it. Well, that's just sad. I mean, then it's just too chocolate. You want, even if it's a thin piece, you want to be able to finish it. So or do you want the chocolate to be in the background? Like something like a tiramisu, there's espresso, there's the custard, and then there's the chocolate, where the chocolate isn't the main player. It's a really important part of the dessert, but it's not the main player. So, I think it depends, again, what my end result what I want it to be. And some things like a brownie, you can get away with using more neutral kind of generic, and not generic in a bad way, but applicable, could be used in many different ways, chocolate or something. One of my new fun things I've lately been doing is making water ganache truffles, where instead of a truffle where you add cream, you just add water. And what's so amazing about that is just actually the first couple of times I did it, it was really shocking. It's just how much the chocolate flavor comes through, because you don't have all that dairy to kind of mask the flavors. And it doesn't mask it in a bad way. It just kind of mutes it and turns it into a little something else. So if you really want to play around with different chocolates and see what they really taste like, just make a water ganache truffle. And I got that idea from Paul Young. I don't know if any of you from London are on the thing, because ckbk is English, is that he's a very well-known chocolatier from London, and his things are just extraordinary, and he really turned me on to that. And it's a really, again, it's kind of like it's an even easier way to fool around with different varieties of chocolate. And then you roll those in different cocoa powders. I think someone had asked that question, is if you rolled it into a Dutch processed or other kinds of cocoa powder, you're going to get a different hit and a different intensity. And the great news is there's no wrong or there's no right. There's no one answer. There's just so many different things that you can do. So it's more, again, what I want the main end result to be, and what I want also the texture to be, because we were talking about that earlier with cocoa powder. Do I want chocolate, but I don't want it so fat feeling in my mouth, and I might use a cocoa powder versus, something else.
Yeah. Someone also asked, why do some recipes use solid baker's chocolate and some use cocoa powder?
Well, I mean, if they're using cocoa powder, I mean, they have to, get it depends on what they're making, because if you're going to make a cake, you need to get that fat in there in some other capacity. So it's just.
I was going to say, I think just to maybe add a little clarity to the question, and if you have follow-ups, just put the follow-ups in the Q&A. But I think sometimes you can, if you don't have unsweetened chocolate, you can use powder, and there's an equivalent. You add a certain amount of butter to replace the cocoa butter fat that would have come from the chocolate. So that's kind of a shortcut cheat if you're in the kitchen and and you're like want to make a fudgy brownie, but you don't have any unsweetened chocolate, but you've got cocoa powder. Usually there's a conversion that you can use, or you could just look it up. We've got a conversion on our cocoa powders, and that'll help. We also just launched an organic natural cocoa powder, and a good friend of both Emily and mine, Alice Medrich, she helped us write a little guide to cocoa powder usage and understanding the differences between the two. And you can access that on our website. If you go to our homepage and scroll down, there's a little image of the new product, and click on that, and you'll have access to Alice's guide. But there's some really important tips in there just about replacements, and then flavor differences, and how you can use a powder in some recipes versus not. And, in some recipes, and Emily, you can speak more to this than I always get confused, but you can use a Dutch powder and some you can't use a natural because of the leavening. And we've all got all that sort of outlined in that guide. So for anyone who really wants to nerd out on cocoa powder, I encourage you to look into that. But yeah, I think just generally speaking, it kind of depends on the recipe, whether it's powder or unsweetened chocolate. But yeah, hopefully that answers the question. Let's see here. We have about 10 minutes left. So if anyone's got a burning question, please put it in the chat. We've got quite a few to get through, so I might just start there. So we've got a question: when dusting classic chocolate truffles and cocoa powder, which would you recommend? I know you alluded to this, Emily, but do you want to speak to this more explicitly?
I think I would do half and half. Sorry. I would do half.
Diplomatic answer.
No, it's not being diplomatic, because I just think you get something, if you get something different. And when I take like chocolates or truffles or anything to anyone's house or anything, I always like to that's an easy way to an experiment without baking twice. And it's just, people love the contrast and just trying different things. So I just think it's more fun. So.
Yeah, no, for sure. Sorry, I'm just trying to manage the Q&A as well.
There's one, the pan au chocolat sticks.
Oh,
for
yes.
Cookies.
Yes.
I have not, but I bet you that would be really good. My only, I don't know if people are familiar with the pan au chocolat sticks, but they're about this width of a Q-tip. I know that doesn't sound very appetizing, but, and they're put in pan au chocolat. So when they're rolled up, you get that nice piece. So I would, since they are thinner, I would probably, and not as wide, I would probably keep them as long as possible. And heck, you could even take a chocolate chip cookie circle, like a dough ball, pat it down a little bit, put them on, and then roll it up, and then kind of fold it under, and then to keep their shape. But
yeah, no, that's great. Someone asked a question about tempering. Do you want to take that on? We do have some resources on our website, some tempering guides, as well as a couple videos on how to temper. There's different ways. There's tabletop tempering. Some people swear by using a microwave as a method of tempering. But Emily, do you want to talk to that at all?
Yeah, the question is, when is tempering or crystallizing a ganache appropriate for various applications, including bonbon fillings and robing, dipping, etc.? I think the thing is, when you're making a bonbon, you want it to be tempered because you just get that nice snap and you get that nice, beautiful sheen on it. I actually, and saying this as a pastry chef, any pastry chef that says they love to temper chocolate by hand, I'm sorry, I think they're lying, because it's so meticulous. It's such a pain in the neck, and it's so fickle. But that being said, I'm sure Eric Kepler's, I know on here, he probably likes chocolate tempering. So on the one hand, I avoid tempering as much as I possibly can. On the other hand, if you're going to do bonbons and things like that, it's really important. Now, I'm just going to mention this briefly, and you can go online and look at it, but there's a way that you can temper cocoa butter, mix it into melted chocolate at a certain temperature, and it instantly tempers your chocolate. And so I encourage you to look into that, because it makes tempering, so much easier, because tempering is really important when it comes to chocolates and confections and things like that. And if you want more information, just give Matthew, your email, and I'll get back to you on it. But
yeah, no, that's great. I know someone asked about a recipe for water ganache truffle.
Yeah, I usually do, I didn't put in the thing, it's like 150 grams of sugar, 300 grams of water, and 700 grams of chocolate. But I will adjust that sugar depending on the chocolate sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. And I think Paul Young may have some recipes out.
Yeah, he's
about.
got a bunch of videos on there.
Yeah, yeah, it's great. And then someone asked again, how are signature flavor notes chosen for Guittard couverture chocolates? This is a very iterative process at Guittard. As I sort of alluded to, we pride ourselves on sort of honoring the flavor of the beans, and we oftentimes first start with what we're trying to achieve and the purpose of the chocolate that we're making. And it's a very collective, collaborative, iterative process. My dad, Gary, is very involved in the business still, and flavor is his passion. And so we will oftentimes sit around the table with product development team, myself, my dad, and our pastry chefs, and just sort of try different blends and figure out how we're wanting to use it. Sometimes it's a single origin, but it really depends on sort of the goal. But again, we look at our couverture line as wanting to deliver sort of a palette of flavors to pastry chefs and confectioners and bakers who are going to be using our chocolate, and making sure that we're providing sort of a variety of flavor profiles for a variety of different applications that take into account the rheology, as we've talked about, the appropriate form factor, and then also delivers that flavor in the right way. So it's a very fun process. It involves lots and lots of tasting, everything from liquor to finished product. So it's great. And then someone said, look out for easy temper. This machine makes tempering a breeze. Thanks for that, Lou. Do you have a favorite chocolate cake recipe? I'll let you answer that one.
Oh, are you talking chocolate layer cake? If you're talking chocolate layer cake, yes, I do. And I'll give it to Matthew. It's actually a combination of cocoa powder and melted chocolate, both, where you make a paste with water out of the cocoa powder, and then you add the melted chocolate and eggs and sugar and stuff. But I'll get that recipe to Matthew and I'll have him send it out. It's a chocolate cake with a chocolate frosting. Yeah.
Great. And then someone asked, any tips on making chocolate with monk fruit or stevia? We have a stevia based product that we launched last year. So there's that I can clue you in on if you're interested in trying it. We have a 61% and a 58%. But yeah, it's
yeah, I think with those kind of things, you can start fooling around. The easiest is in like chocolate sauces, truffles, and things like that. It's when you're making a cake and you're like creaming butter and sugar, and then you're going to add your chocolate. That's when it becomes more problematic, because the sugar and the stevia or the monkfish don't just act in the same way. And I know there are a lot of recipes online from the companies, and I think that's probably the best place to go, because they've done the most work on it.
Yeah. So we've only got 2 minutes left. I think maybe we should wrap it up just in the spirit of time and everyone's attention, but we really, really appreciate everyone joining us today and asking such tremendous questions. And hopefully you came away learning some. And again, just to emphasize, we'll be following up with some of these links that we've been referencing, recipes, tips, and the additional questions that came through around such things like tempering and water ganache and all that kind of stuff. But please, if you've got additional questions, send them to Matthew at ckbk, and we'll try and include them in the follow-ups. And thank you again, all of you. And you can access these recipes on ckbk. And in the meantime, happy baking, happy chocolate eating, be well, and we will hopefully see you all soon.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.